July 27, 1943. A German radar operator in Hamburg stares at his Würzburg screen as it transforms from a precise tracking instrument into useless chaos. Where moments before he could follow individual RAF bombers with perfect clarity, now his display shows only a blinding mass of phantom echoes, thousands of aircraft appearing from nowhere. The sophisticated radar system, backbone of Germany's night defenses, has gone completely blind. What he cannot know is that 92 million strips of aluminum foil are falling through the darkness above his city. What he will learn within the hour is that 787 British bombers are about to create the first man-made firestorm in human history. By dawn, 37,000 people will be dead, the streets themselves will have melted, and Albert Speer will inform Hitler that 6 more raids like this will end the war. This is the story of how aluminum foil broke Germany's defenses, and how ordinary fire became apocalyptic. Hamburg in summer 1943 was Germany's second largest city and Europe's most important port. The Blohm and Voss shipyards alone would produce 224 U-boats during the war, submarines that nearly strangled Britain's Atlantic lifeline. The Hamburg-Harburg area contained major oil refineries, the Klöckner aero engine factory, and the Hamburger Flugzeugbau aircraft works. Rail and shipping networks made it a critical logistics hub connecting Germany's war industry to occupied Europe. The city had been bombed before. Previous RAF raids scattered bombs across Hamburg with minimal effect. A January 1943 attack with approximately 150 bombers produced fires that German civil defense easily contained. Hamburg's defenses appeared formidable: 21 heavy anti-aircraft batteries, 84 heavy guns, over 100 machine guns, and a sophisticated network of searchlights controlled by radar. Above all, the city lay within the Kammhuber Line, Germany's belt of radar-controlled defensive zones that stretched across occupied Europe. Each zone used paired Würzburg radar sets to guide night fighters with lethal precision toward incoming bombers. British bomber crews flying against Hamburg faced odds that made completing a 30-mission tour statistically improbable. Loss rates over heavily defended German cities ran approximately 6% per raid. Simple mathematics meant that most crews would not survive. The radar-directed night fighters and flak guns killed bombers with industrial efficiency. Germany's defensive system represented years of refinement, millions of Reichsmarks in investment, and the concentrated effort of thousands of technicians and operators. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding RAF Bomber Command since February 1942, had watched his bombers die in these proportions for over a year. The Butt Report of August 1941 had revealed brutal truth. Only 1 bomber in 3 dropped bombs within 5 miles of its target. Precision bombing was fantasy. Harris embraced the alternative. If you cannot hit factories, destroy the workers and their housing. The target shifted from industry to morale, from military objectives to what Harris termed the enemy civilian population, and in particular the industrial workers. Hamburg offered Harris his proof of concept. The city's coastal location and prominent river Elbe made navigation simple. Dense apartment buildings with exposed wooden construction created ideal conditions for incendiary attack. Most importantly, Harris now possessed a weapon that would blind Germany's defenses completely. They called it Window. Aluminum-backed paper strips, each precisely 27 centimeters long, exactly half the wavelength of German Würzburg radar. The concept was elegant and devastatingly simple. Drop millions of these strips over a target, and German radar screens would become useless. Each strip created a radar echo indistinguishable from an aircraft. Multiply that by 92 million strips, and the defensive system collapsed into white noise. British scientists had developed Window in 1942. For over a year, Winston Churchill and his military commanders refused to authorize its use. The fear was simple: if we use it, Germany will use it against us. But by July 1943, the calculation had shifted. Germany's bombing campaign against Britain had effectively ended. RAF Bomber Command was hemorrhaging aircraft and crews over Germany. Window represented the difference between sustainable losses and catastrophic attrition. The decision came down from the highest level. Window would debut over Hamburg. Flight Lieutenant Ronald Smith sat in the navigator's position of a Lancaster bomber from 7th Squadron as his aircraft approached Hamburg on the night of July 24, 1943. Behind him in the fuselage, crew members prepared the window bundles, packages containing 2,200 strips of black paper backed with aluminum foil. The drill was simple: drop 1 bundle per minute through the flare chute, maintain precise timing using stopwatches. Smith had flown 38 missions over Germany. He knew what to expect over Hamburg: searchlights sweeping the sky in coordinated patterns directed by radar, flak bursting at predicted altitudes, night fighters vectored to intercept positions by ground controllers watching bomber streams on radar displays. On previous Hamburg Hamburg raids, his squadron had lost aircraft at rates that made every mission feel like rolling dice with death. Tonight felt different. The air over Hamburg should have been filled with coordinated defensive fire. Instead, the searchlights wandered aimlessly across the sky. The flak bursts appeared random, scattered across altitudes with no apparent pattern. The master searchlights that normally locked onto bombers with terrifying precision simply swept back and forth like blind men groping in darkness. Smith did not know what was happening on the ground below. He could not see the chaos in German radar stations and fighter control centers. He simply knew that for the first time in 38 missions, Hamburg's defenses had lost their edge. In the Luftwaffe fighter control center serving Hamburg, operators watched their displays transform into chaos. The radar screens that normally showed individual aircraft as distinct blips now displayed solid masses of echoes. Thousands of targets appeared simultaneously. Controllers attempting to vector night fighters toward bomber streams found themselves directing pilots toward phantom aircraft that existed only as aluminum strips floating through the darkness. Major Hajo Hermann, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot who would later develop new fighter tactics in response to Window, captured the moment's significance. The defensive system that Germany had refined over years of aerial warfare had become worthless in minutes, all because of paper and aluminum foil. Wilhelm Jonen, flying a Bf-110 night fighter equipped with Liechtenstein airborne radar, experienced the collapse firsthand. His radar display, normally showing clear returns from bomber formations, suddenly filled with false echoes. Unable to distinguish real aircraft from aluminum strips, unable to receive coherent guidance from ground controllers, Jonen flew in rage and frustration through empty sky while Hamburg burned behind him. He would later discover he had inadvertently flown toward Amsterdam, miles from the bomber stream, while his city absorbed hundreds of tons of high explosive and incendiaries. The statistics told the story. Of 791 British bombers dispatched that first night, only 12 were lost, a loss rate of 1.5%. Window had neutralized approximately 75% of German defensive capability in a single stroke. The night fighters utterly failed to find the bomber stream. The flak guns fired randomly, or not at all. The searchlights wandered aimlessly. For RAF Bomber Command, Window changed everything. Losses that had made the bombing campaign barely sustainable suddenly dropped to levels that made deep penetration raids viable. Harris immediately ordered maximum exploitation. Hamburg would receive not one raid, but a sustained campaign designed to destroy the city completely. Operation Gomorrah, the code name, carried biblical weight. 4 major RAF night raids and 2 American daylight raids over 10 days. The goal was systematic annihilation: housing, industry, infrastructure, and the civilian population that sustained Germany's war effort. The first 3 raids damaged Hamburg significantly, but produced conventional destruction. Fires burned, buildings collapsed, civilians died in numbers that shocked but did not break German civil defense. Then came the night of July 27th to 28th. Kate Hofmeister was 19 years old. She lived with her family in the Hammerbrook district, a densely packed working-class neighborhood of multi-story apartment buildings with wooden construction and narrow streets. The area had survived the first raids with damage but remained largely intact. On the evening of July 27th, Kate and her family took shelter in their basement as air raid sirens wailed across Hamburg. 787 RAF bombers, 353 Lancasters, 244 Halifaxes, 116 Sterlings, and 74 Wellingtons approached Hamburg in a stream that stretched across miles of night sky. Approximately 722 reached the city and bombed. What they dropped would create conditions that had never existed before in human history. The attack followed calculated sequence. First came the blockbuster bombs, 8,000-pound weapons designed to tear roofs off buildings and shatter windows. 4,000-pound cookies followed, massive blast bombs that exposed the combustible interiors of structures to incendiary attack. Then came the fire weapons, 350,412 individual 4-pound magnesium thermite incendiaries, larger 30-pound phosphorus devices. In 45 to 50 minutes, the bombers dropped 2,313 tons of ordnance, including 1,174 tons of incendiaries. Several factors aligned that night to transform conventional bombing into unprecedented catastrophe. An extended heat wave had left Hamburg tinder dry. Humidity was low. No rain had fallen in days. The working-class districts targeted, Hammerbrook, Billwerder, Borgfelder, and Rothenburg sort, featured densely packed apartment buildings with exposed wooden construction. Previous raids had already damaged infrastructure and exhausted fire services. Hanover's fire crews, which had reinforced Hamburg's firefighters, had been recalled to their own city. Most critically, the bomb concentration was perfect. Unlike scattered earlier raids, this attack landed ordnance in a tightly focused pattern. The density of incendiaries per square kilometer exceeded any previous raid in the war. Within 30 minutes, the entire target area was ablaze. Individual fires began merging, Then physics intervened. As the massive conflagration consumed oxygen, it created a powerful updraft. Superheated air rose in a column reaching 460 meters into the night sky. Fresh air rushed in from surrounding areas to replace it. The wind velocities at street level reached 240 kilometers per hour. Some accounts report gusts approaching 170 miles per hour. The fire had become self-sustaining, generating its own weather system. Ground temperatures exceeded 800 degrees Celsius. In some areas, they approached 1,000 degrees. The thermal cyclone measured 3.5 kilometers in diameter. The firestorm burned actively for over 4 hours. Some fires would continue for days afterward. In its wake lay 21 square kilometers of complete destruction. 16,000 apartment buildings had been incinerated. Kate Hofmeister emerged from her shelter to find a world transformed into hell. The rain of large sparks blowing down the street were each as large as a 5-mark piece. She struggled to run against wind that felt like a physical wall, pushing her backward. She could only reach a house on the corner of Sorbenstrasse. They could not continue across Eiferstrasse because the asphalt road had melted. There were people on the roadway, some already dead, some still alive but stuck in the asphalt. They must have rushed onto the roadway without thinking. Their feet had become trapped, and then they had put out their hands trying to free themselves. They were on their hands and knees screaming. The wind was so strong it picked up human beings and threw them through the air. Children running alone were bodily lifted from the ground. The streets were burning. The trees were burning. The air itself seemed to burn. Kate passed fused masses of people made up of 4 or 5 corpses, each probably a family, visible only as piles of burned substance no larger than a small child. The heat had shrunk them. The firestorm did not discriminate between young and old, strong and weak, prepared and unprepared. Everyone in the target area faced the same physics. For those in shelters, asphyxiation became the primary killer. As the firestorm consumed available oxygen and generated carbon monoxide, people in basement shelters died without flames ever touching them. The Hamburg police president's official report noted that in some shelters, doctors could only provide rough estimates of death counts based on the layer of ashes remaining. In one shelter, the estimate was 250 to 300 people, determinable only by ash depth. Hans Erich Nossack, a German novelist who witnessed the attack from outside Hamburg, captured the moment when the sound of 1,800 aircraft reached the ground. One did not dare to inhale for fear of breathing it in. It was the sound of 1,800 airplanes approaching Hamburg from the south at unimaginable height. And yet there was immediate recognition. This was what everyone had been waiting for, what had hung for months like a shadow over everything we did, making us weary. It was the end. 20,000 feet above the inferno, RAF bomber crews witnessed something that would haunt many for the rest of their lives. Leonard Cooper, flight engineer with 7 Squadron flying a Lancaster, watched smoke rising to 20,000 feet. The smoke carried with it the stink of burning human flesh. Decades later, interviewed about that night, Cooper said simply, it was not a thing he would like to talk about. Trevor Timperley of 156 Squadron flew 2 missions over Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah. He described the city on the night of July 27th to 28th as a sea of flames. The firestorm's glow was visible 200 miles away. Crews on their return flight could still see Hamburg burning behind them when they were halfway back to England. Halifax crews reported a mass of raging fires with black smoke rising to 19,000 feet. One Lancaster cruise log recorded with military understatement that many fires with much smoke were seen up to 14,000 feet. The clinical language belied what they were witnessing. The first time human beings had deliberately created a firestorm. The contrast with what crews had expected was stark. Flight Lieutenant Davidson, veteran of 39 previous bombing missions, recalled the morning of July 24th beginning warm and bright. Then word came that operations were scheduled and his gut began its familiar crawl. Previous Hamburg raids had cost his squadron dearly, but with window deployed, the defenses that crews dreaded simply were not there anymore. The invisible strips of aluminum foil had accomplished what years of tactical evolution could not. They had broken Germany's defensive system completely. Yet even crews protected by window and watching from 20,000 feet felt the weight of what they were doing. Some wrestled with it for decades. Others simply refused to discuss it. The firestorm had crossed a threshold that conventional bombing had not. This was not destruction of industry or military targets. This was the annihilation of a city and everyone in it. The destruction shocked German leadership at the highest levels. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, traveled to Hamburg in the aftermath. What he saw put, as he would later write, the fear of God into him. Speer immediately grasped the strategic implications. At an Air Ministry meeting, he warned that repeating this success on 4 or 5 other German towns would lead to collapse. He informed Hitler directly that 6 more attacks similar to Operation Gomorrah would bring armaments production to a halt. For one of the few times in the war, Speer spoke with naked honesty about Germany's vulnerability. The damage assessment justified his alarm. Approximately 37,000 civilians dead, though estimates ranged from 34,000 to 45,000. Many bodies were never recovered, identifiable only by ash layers in basement shelters. 180,000 people wounded. 1 million people evacuated Hamburg within a week. Nearly half the city's population simply fled. 61% of housing stock destroyed or damaged. 214,350 dwellings out of 414,500 rendered uninhabitable. 183 large factories destroyed out of 524. 4,118 smaller factories destroyed out of 9,068. 3 U-boats destroyed at Blohm and Voss. The transportation network severely damaged. Water and power systems collapsed across large areas. The human impact exceeded statistics. Mathilde Wolf Münkeberg, a 64-year-old Hamburg resident, wrote to her children abroad describing the aftermath. There was no gas, no electricity, not a drop of water. Neither the lift nor the telephone was working. It was hard to imagine the panic and chaos, each one for himself. Only one idea: flight. She observed something remarkable in the days following the firestorm. People wearing party badges had them torn off their coats. There were screams of "Let us get that murderer." The police did nothing. For a brief moment, the Nazi state's control appeared fragile in Hamburg. But the moment passed. The security apparatus reasserted control. The anger turned inward into despair rather than outward into resistance. Yet German resilience defied Allied expectations. Within 5 months, Hamburg had restored 80% of its pre-bombing industrial production. The U-boat pens, protected by 12-foot concrete roofs, proved impervious to conventional bombs. Workers returned, factories reopened, the city's strategic industries adapted, dispersed, continued functioning. Speer's initial panic faded as he observed this recovery. He eventually concluded that area bombing was not as great a threat as previously assumed. The firestorm had demonstrated the maximum destructive potential of conventional bombing, and Germany had absorbed it and continued fighting. Operation Gomorrah forced fundamental restructuring of German air defense. General Joseph Kammhuber, who commanded German night fighter forces, admitted candidly that the entire defense was blinded in one stroke. The timing, he acknowledged, was perfect. German industry was too stretched by V-2 rocket production and other priority programs to rapidly develop effective countermeasures. Kammhuber was removed from command following Hamburg's destruction. New tactics emerged from necessity. Oberst Hajo Hermann developed wild boar tactics, where single-engine fighters flew above the flak ceiling and attacked bombers visually using the fires below as illumination. 3 new fighter wings were formed specifically for this purpose. Zahme-Sau Time Boar tactics used running commentary broadcasts to direct night fighters toward bomber streams without relying on radar interception. German engineers developed new radar systems. The SN2 radar operated on different frequencies that Window could not effectively jam, but the adaptation took time. For months after Operation Gomorrah, RAF Bomber Command enjoyed significantly reduced losses. Window had bought the British a window of tactical advantage that they exploited ruthlessly. The broader strategic impact was measurable. By August 1943, 45% of all German fighters had been relocated to home defense. Heavy anti-aircraft guns in Germany increased by over 25%. Eventually, anti-aircraft units would consume 25% of all German ammunition production. This diversion from frontline combat represented an unintended but significant strategic benefit of the bombing campaign. The moral and strategic debate over Operation Gomorrah continues 8 decades later. The questions Hamburg raises remain contested and uncomfortable. The moral case against area bombing centers on deliberate targeting of civilians. Philosopher A.C. Grayling argues that the campaign claimed lives of 800,000 civilian women, children and men and involved the commission of wrongs. Historian Michael Bess goes further, stating there can be no excuse. These were atrocities pure and simple. Atrocities because the Anglo-Americans could definitely have won the war without resorting to them. The comparison to atomic weapons appears repeatedly in post-war assessments. USAAF Surgeon Major Cortez Enloy, who examined both Hamburg and Nagasaki, judged Nagasaki's fire effects not nearly as bad as the effects of the RAF raids on Hamburg. The firestorm killed more people in one night than the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The moral case for area bombing rests on context. Nazi Germany's aggression and genocide, the limited options available to Britain before D-Day opened a Western front, the measurable resource diversion it forced on Germany. Historian Richard Overy criticizes moral assessments of the bombing campaign for being too often based on speculation and unverified data rather than rigorous analysis of what alternatives actually existed in 1943. The effectiveness debate yields complex conclusions. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, found that strategic bombing was decisive in Western Europe, but that precision attacks on oil and transportation networks proved far more effective than area attacks on cities. German morale deteriorated but never collapsed. The survey noted that maximum morale effects would actually have been achieved through lighter raids distributed over wider areas, the opposite of Hamburg's concentrated devastation. Britain's official history concluded the campaign shortened the war by at least 6 months through resource diversion, if nothing else. Modern economic historians have quantified the damage: 35% reduction in German tank production, 31% reduction in aircraft, 42% reduction in trucks during 1943. These are not negligible impacts, yet Hamburg itself demonstrated both the power and the limits of area bombing. It created unprecedented destruction, and Hamburg recovered within months. It terrorized the civilian population, and the Nazi police state ensured that terror never translated into effective resistance. It diverted German resources to home defense, and those resources might have been diverted regardless given Germany's overall strategic situation by mid-1943. The question that haunts Hamburg is not whether the bombing was effective in some narrow military sense. The question is whether the specific choice to create a firestorm that would kill tens of thousands of civilians was necessary or justified given the alternatives available. That question admits no easy answer. Different historians examining the same evidence reach different conclusions based on how they weigh competing moral considerations and strategic assessments. What remains undisputed is that Operation Gomorrah established precedents that shaped the remainder of the war. The tactics refined over Hamburg: mass incendiary attack, systematic destruction of urban areas, deliberate targeting of civilian housing to destroy worker morale, would be applied to Dresden in February 1945, to dozens of Japanese cities in spring 1945, and would inform the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The firestorm itself became a template that planners attempted, mostly unsuccessfully, to replicate. Only Dresden would experience a comparable phenomenon in Europe. The specific combination of weather conditions, building density, bomb concentration timing, and overwhelming incendiary tonnage that created Hamburg's thermal cyclone proved extraordinarily difficult to recreate deliberately. It was, in a sense, a perfect storm, and perfect storms by definition do not occur on demand. That night of July 27th to 28th, 1943, represented a threshold crossing. Conventional bombing had killed civilians before, strategic bombing had targeted cities before, but Hamburg was different in degree sufficient to constitute difference in kind. The streets melted. People stuck in asphalt burned alive. The wind generated by the firestorm threw human beings through the air. Temperatures exceeded those in cremation ovens. An entire district of a major city simply ceased to exist, vaporized in physics that seemed to belong to some future apocalypse rather than the present war. The German radar operator who watched his screen dissolve into chaos at the beginning of that night witnessed the opening move of a campaign that would redefine urban warfare. The aluminum strips falling through darkness were not just a tactical countermeasure. They were the key that unlocked a door. Behind that door lay capabilities that humanity had not possessed before. The ability to generate artificial firestorms, to create urban-scale destruction in hours, to kill tens of thousands of people in a single night through systematic application of incendiary weapons against civilian populations. Once opened, that door remained open. Dresden would follow. Tokyo would follow. The logic of total war, once embraced, generated its own momentum. If aluminum strips could blind radar, use them. If concentrated incendiaries could create firestorms, create them. If area bombing could divert enemy resources, continue it. Each decision followed rationally from previous decisions. Each escalation seemed justified by the escalation that preceded it. Hamburg was the moment when the British demonstrated they could destroy a German city completely in a single night. The moment when defensive systems built over years proved helpless against simple countermeasures. The moment when ordinary fire became something unprecedented. A thermal cyclone that generated its own weather, consumed oxygen faster than humans could breathe, and killed through physics as much as flame. That is what happened in the skies and streets of Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah. 787 bombers carrying aluminum strips and incendiaries, 92 million pieces of foil falling through darkness, radar screens dissolving into useless static, 350,000 thermite bombs igniting across 21 square kilometers, physics taking over as fire merged into firestorm, 37,000 people dead, 1 million people fleeing, a city burning burning bright enough to see from 200 miles away. And on his radar screen, the German operator watching the system he trusted transform into chaos, understanding too late that the rules had changed, that the defenses he manned had become irrelevant, that aluminum foil had accomplished what years of Allied bombing could not. It had rendered Hamburg defenseless. The fire would do the rest. That is not propaganda. That is what 92 million strips of aluminum foil and 2,300 tons of incendiaries accomplished on the night of July 27, 1943. The first man-made firestorm, the template for total war, the moment when technology broke defense and physics consumed a city. Hamburg burned because aluminum broke radar and fire found perfect conditions. Simple as that, terrible as that.